on our website, socialistaction.org. So please do so. So we're going to start tonight hearing from Rob, and then followed by Jeff. And then please do use the chat function on the YouTube video. We'll be also taking some time at the end of the discussion for some question and dialogue on this topic. Hope to hear your comments. All right, so without further ado, we'll start off with Rob. Welcome, Rob.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I've been asked to kind of summarize some of our ideas around COVID-19 in about 10 minutes. That's going to be very difficult, but we are going to do the best we can here. I'll start off by saying that basically all of us have had coronavirus, but not the coronavirus you think of. Basically, you have these alpha coronaviruses that are basically a source of one source of the common cold. But that's not the one that we're all worried about. It's what are called these beta coronaviruses. So you had SARS-1 emerge in 2002 out of Guangdong, a southeastern province in China. It spilled over and affected about 10,000 people, mainly in China, but also scattered elsewhere around the world. Toronto comes to mind. In 2012, we had the emergence of MERS, which is another beta coronavirus out of Saudi Arabia. And then starting in the end of last year, at the end of December 2019, you had the emergence of another SARS. We now know it as SARS-2. It seemed to be centered around a wet market in Wuhan, Hubei in China. Though that now is becoming somewhat controversial in the sense of that the story of that emergence is much more complicated. If you look at the genetics of the virus, it's a combination of a bat coronavirus and a pangolin coronavirus. Pangolin's a kind of a cute little anteater looking mammal that has been used in a lot of wildlife trafficking. It's used in Chinese traditional medicine for its scales. It's starting to show up on some dinner menus in some affluent restaurants in China and elsewhere. So there's a big market for developing pangolin farming. So somewhere along the way, a bat coronavirus mixed up with a pangolin coronavirus, and then adapted a little bit to the human immune system to be able to go human to human. And whether or not he emerged directly out of southern China or in Wuhan directly, it's still controversial. Still being worked out in terms of the details, but eventually makes its way to Wuhan and then skips on to the global air travel network and goes around the world into the pandemic that we know today. What's interesting about this, of course, is that in some ways, this SARS-2 is, despite the fact it's very different from many other of the pandemic or proto-pandemic strains that have been emerging since the turn of the century. So we all remember the first celebrity virus of the century, H5N1, that's the influenza. They emerged out of Guangdong. There's also strains of swine influenza, H1N1 2009, that emerged out of outside Mexico City. It spread around the world. And of course, along with the MERS and SARS-1, there was, of course, Ebola coming out of West Africa that spilled over and infected 35,000 people, leaving bodies in the streets of regional capitals. So there have been a series of different pathogens that have emerged that have threatened to go pandemic. A couple of them have gone pandemic, and they're all very different from each other. So it gives the impression that that they have nothing to do with each other. But in fact, there have been shifts in the land use, typically driven out capital that's extending from one side of the world to the other to basically better commoditize local forest for intensive agriculture, for mining, for logging, in order to be able to produce commodities to be shipped onto the other side of the world. And what that has done is that it's increased the interface between what were previously marginalized reservoirs of species that carried some of these dangerous pathogens, and local livestock and local labor that help raise the livestock. in such a way, increasing the spillover rate and also the diversity of pathogens that are spilled over. Many of these livestock are subsequently shipped to food hubs near urban centers for either processing or global shipping out, or some of these pathogens are able to make their way into labor that are, by virtue of being subjected to structural adjustment and changes in the global economy, are having to engage in what's called cycle migration. They have to migrate to the cities for work and then subsequently make their way back to their hometowns in the rural areas to help out with the seasonal agriculture. So we have a broad, expanding circuit by which pathogens that were originally marginalized to forests are subsequently able to hitch a ride, as it were, to their local regional capital in ways that they weren't able to do before. And then if they're given a chance to be able to go human to human, make their way on an increasingly integrated global network and make their way to one side of the world or the other. Now, I think my last point for now, as a way to starting us off, is that there's been a lot of focus among some scientists on those actual practices involved in at the point of attack, as it were, at the GPS coordinate at which a pathogen might emerge. So there's a lot of focus on what indigenous groups are doing and what local smallholders are doing. So there's a lot of focus to try to, in essence, blame those groups of people for how a pathogen was able to make its way out of a forest and onto to the rest of the world. And that focus, of course, serves the interests of those companies and multinationals who are in the business of actually pushing out smallholders and indigenous to be able to take over and use the shrinking availability of local forests for their own uses. My group's attention is more directed on the sources of the money that's actually driving the deforestation development. So our vision of it is that we see places like New York, Hong Kong, and London, which are the centers of capital from which the money originates to be able to engage in the development and deforestation. We're calling those cities, in fact, the worst disease hotspots, because that's where all the action is in terms of driving the change in land uses that leads to the spillover of these dangerous pathogens that subsequently make their way out. And it's been, many of us have been worried about this for some time. We've been able to dodge bullet after bullet in terms of many of these pathogens. Even swine flu 2009, even though it did go pandemic, it wasn't as dangerous as it could have been. But now it is, we've gotten to a point where we've developed a pathogen that was able to go human to human and is actually much more dangerous and with the potential of actually killing many millions of people.
Thank you, Rob. That's a great introduction. I also want to mention that Rob does have a really great article published in Monthly Review this month as well. So please take the time to check that out. It's a really great in-depth look at the current pandemic. So next we're going to hear from Jeff MACKLER, who's the Socialist Action presidential candidate. He also has an article published in Counterpunch just a few days ago on the pandemic. So take it away, Jeff.
Well, thanks, Lisa, and thanks, Rob. What Rob points out is that the pandemic itself is inseparable from the functioning of the capitalist system. And that is a system for which profit trumps life itself on the planet. We see this with global warming, where a handful of corporations, multi-billion, if not trillion-dollar oil companies for profit, continue to produce the very fossil fuels whose continued use spells doom for humanity. We've been having a bit of a problem with regard to the climate change movement because people say that doomsday is 20 years hence, even though others say it's happening today. But we have time, maybe till 2015, to solve the problem of of the use of fossil fuels that destroy, threaten to destroy the basic relationships between human beings, where they live and whether they can survive. And now along comes this pandemic, COVID-19, which is not 20 years away, it's today. It's right at us. And I'm imagining that we need a twofold approach. Rob's analysis, which I think is shared by most serious scientists, is the continuation of big farming and all that's associated with it on the one hand, and the destruction of the ecosystems of the world, ever bringing human beings in contact with species that were previously isolated. That's one element of the problem. And the other element of the problem is, as Rob says, the contradiction in the way we conduct scientific research in the world today. Suddenly there is a rush to find a cure, with nations competing with each other, with giant corporations like Pfizer. I used to work for Pfizer when I was a youth in their laboratories, and they're teamed up with, I believe, a Belgian corporation wanting to be first to develop a cure so they can make a profit. And the same thing with all the other major corporations in the world, in the United States, and even in India, which is the largest manufacturer of many of the vaccines that are used around the world. So here you have a situation where whoever finds a vaccine, assuming it can be found, is going to profit, is going to patent it, and is going to charge for it and fight in the international markets to maintain its exclusive right to use it or sell it to others for profit. In the society that we would like to build, we would have an international coordinated collaboration of the scientific community, wherein every single discovery that advanced the interests of humankind would be immediately known to everyone else, where teams would coordinate rather than compete. I'm reminded in my youth of the battle over the structure of DNA, when Watson and Crick, who were the final discoverers of the structure of DNA, had a meeting with the son of Linus Pauling, who then was the only person on Earth who had two unshared Nobel Prizes. He was the dean of modern chemistry. And they asked the visiting son of Linus how his father was doing in the race to find the structure of DNA. And when his son revealed the scientific approaches that Pauling, as a protein chemist, was using, they were glad to hear that he was heading in the wrong direction. They didn't bother telling him, the Nobel Prize winning chemist, because they wanted to be first. And they were first. Imagine today the struggle to be first versus the struggle to find a vaccine. Not to mention the struggle to build a world where viruses like this are infrequent, to say the least. And then we have the other side of the equation, the terrible side of the underestimation of the seriousness of the disease, the delay in quarantining it, the allowing people to walk through the streets unhindered with the idea that this was a minor problem. And then the covering up of the death rates in the United States. That death rate is increasing by at least 2,000 every day, and is expected by the end of June, according to the government's own agencies, to be over 3,000 a day, with 75,000 dead, and perhaps 100,000 in the next few weeks, with no end in sight. Some estimates of the scientific community say that we could lose 1 million people. There are already 3.5 million afflicted with COVID-19 worldwide, and 250,000 dead. And yet it appears that the Trump administration, if not the governments of the world, are aiming to return to work as soon as possible, even though many in the scientific community are literally projecting a second wave of the virus, if not a third, that could dwarf the number of dead today. That is, they want working people to return unprotected in a generally unsafe environment to chain themselves to the wheels of the capitalist machinery to make profits. And finally, this virus has revealed an aspect of US, if not world society, that we were not aware of. Before COVID-19, virtually every paper in the United States said we have a stable economy. Trump is likely to be reelected. The economy is doing great. The stock market is soaring. The unemployment rate is the lowest in history. And things are looking good. Today, with the veil of this stability ripped off, it's clear that a huge proportion of the population was really unemployed. Prior to COVID-19, the labor participation rate showed that 35% of the eligible workers didn't have a job. And now, in the past 6 weeks, 30 million people have lost their jobs, and another several million are expected to be announced by the Labor Department in the days ahead, literally on Friday. So we have a situation where perhaps half the population, akin to the Great Depression of 1929, has no work or works part-time, low-wage, no benefit, non-union jobs to meet the profit needs of the capitalist class. We truly live in critical times. We need collective solutions, but that solution begins with an understanding that the source of the problem is the nature of the profit system itself. Rob, your take on it.
Well, you know, there's a lot in what you said. I mean, to fold that in there, there was a question from one of our viewers along the lines of Sam Freeman saying that looking at the money centers is useful, but financialization is only part of the problem. Production and political military power are critical too. And in the course of listening to you, Jeff, you know, to tie these two things together, my take on is that, you know, coming out of World War II, the United States really took on the role of the policeman on the beat for the capitalist system. It was, in fact, organized around trying to make sure that things were run, for the most part, in such a way that the capital can continue to circulate largely on US terms. So what we see here is to use the views along the lines of the world systems theorists. We were in the fruit of the American cycle of accumulation, in which the U.S. took the role to make sure that capital continued to circulate on its terms. And I think what we see here and what you describe in terms of the decline, the inability of the shocking inability of a world superpower unable to handle a pandemic that it was warned about months before is an indication of that we are in many ways exiting the American cycle of accumulation. You know, there's been a complete abandonment of the investment in public health. You have the neoliberalization of the public health and hospital systems, to the point that public health as an idea has been spun off and either completely neglected or financialized in such a way that if we as a population are to be treated by our health, it's at the individual level with you and your doctor if you happen to have insurance. Of course, pathogens don't really care about that. They're not in the business of infecting people, only people who have insurance. In fact, they are in the business of, very much like water through cracks in ice, finding the most susceptible parts of our society, and particularly as many of those people are put in desperate situations, no housing, or forced to work under terrible conditions. And in many ways, there is therefore not much of a surprise, although it is somewhat ironic that many of the meat processing plants across the Midwest and the South and elsewhere are being centers of amplification of this outbreak. Workers are forced to work in terrible conditions. In many ways, there's much sides of beef as the meat that they're cutting into. And as the agricultural system here is so based on economies of scale and being able to make as much meat as possible and shipping it from one side of the world to the other, it's not surprising that infection that starts here in the United States and on the coastal cities would make its way into rural areas by the means by which the rural areas are connected to the rest of the world, and that's through these agribusiness supply lines. But to connect it to what Sam's point was, is that historically speaking, coming out of World War II, the US and the G7 and all the rest of global North in effect used the global South as its combination of its locker room through which it could extract resources, its dumping ground for the worst of its pollution, including some of the worst of the outbreaks that emerged out of that kind of production. And now we have a situation where, in fact, they have done it at such violent course in terms of the extent and the array of commodities that you have a pathogen that, in fact, has emerged out of the global South, or in this case, China is much more part of something of the global North, that it now has spread across the world in such a way that has made us intimately tied into the damage we cause to the rest of the world.
I couldn't agree more. Here we have a nation that prior to the coronavirus cut back scientific research, government-funded agencies that are aimed at prevention, and increased the military budget to $1 trillion a year. To make war, to conquer the world, to send troops everywhere, to capture the resources of the world and enslave working people. So the reason that jobs shift to China or India or Indonesia is because they can have working people there at $1 or $2 an hour as opposed to the United States. That's the tragedy of the imperialist era that we live in. Similarly, we see the same kind of privatization taking place in every aspect of life. In education, we're privatizing schools, in social services, in sewage repair, in virtually every area where there's a profit to be made, the corporations are pressing their governments to do the same, and that is subordinate the needs of the people to profits for the few. The whole idea of a premature return to work shocks me personally, when most scientists understand if we do that without the proper controls, we're going to have a second wave that's even more devastating than the first. I wonder if Rob agrees with that. We have someone also asks about the question of whether or not we can find a virus that is not only specific to a vaccine that is not only specific to influenza, but a more general virus. I'm mindful of the fact that the scientific community is debating this, with some saying that they've been looking for a vaccine for HIV for some 20 years. And although they have some drugs that ameliorate the symptoms, they have yet, after 20 years of research, to solve the problem. It's not an accident. It's not because it's difficult scientifically. It's because a tiny few of the scientists in the world are associated with research At one point in the recent past, literally 90% of the scientists on the planet Earth were involved in military research. That was the greatest expenditure of the United States government, and that's where the money went. We now are about to open the fifth or sixth element of the US military, the Space Force, spending billions, if not trillions of dollars to defend outer space from competition and to otherwise try to exploit the resources millions, if not billions of miles away, while the people of Earth don't have fundamental housing, job security. Look at what this revealed. It revealed that perhaps half of the American people couldn't pay rent, a third to half, that they live paycheck to paycheck, that a crisis like this puts them on the level of poverty, that the National Guard has to be called in to monitor miles and miles of people lined up in cars to get food, when the agribusiness is digging giant ditches to dump food and animals into where they disappear, like in the Depression where they burned mountains of potatoes, and yet people are near starvation at home. What a contradiction that we live in. Every aspect of our lives is suddenly thrown into bold relief. We can't walk into the streets. We can't meet our neighbors. We fear every day that we're going to be a victim. And who are the victims? Overwhelmingly, the poor, Blacks and Latinos, older people, people in rest homes, not to mention the people who are unprotected until recently, if still now, the people who work in hospitals, the workers who clean the hospitals, as well as the doctors and nurses and technicians. So we live in truly a tragic time. And the question is, what is the way out? The answer has to be the system has to be changed fundamentally. In the meantime, we have to fight for every immediate demand. Don't dump the food, give it out. We can produce enough food safely, as much as possible, to feed the entire population. California, where I live, produces enough food to feed most of the people on Earth, and yet we burn it. We live in difficult times, and in my view, I'm interested in yours, this has shaken the confidence of untold millions of people, working people, in the viability of the system itself. And when we are eventually allowed to return to the streets, we're going to see a kind of fight back that we haven't seen in many, many decades.
Well, I would say I would hope so. I mean, you know, we got it's suddenly very much a matter of life and death here in the United States, increasingly so. I mean, record numbers of people thrown onto unemployment. I mean, astonishing. You know, within a month, you know, 33 million people or so applying for unemployment. Many of them are not even getting it. You have 1 in 5 children are not being fed enough to eat. And you have, you know, food pantries are being slammed with, you know, miles of cars waiting to come and pick up some food. I mean, you have an astonishing reversal in a global fortune, and the sense of that, you know, much of the world that was in essence had to follow with either whether they wanted to or not, American dictates in terms of global political economy are now in a place to be able to spin off on their own. You have the sight of Vietnam sending mass to Great Britain. You have the sight of Cuba sending doctors to Italy, a NATO member. You have the sight of African countries being able to push out as much testing as they need, coming back with results in 4 hours, where here in the United States, even if you do get a test, some people have to wait as long as 10 days. I mean, it's an extraordinary shift in a way that really just shows that a society organized around producing profit at the expense, as its prime directive, at the expense of everything else, isn't it's just about no society at all. And to tie into my discussion or description of the kind of the end of the American cycle, you know, basic Marx, you know, the beginning of the cycle, you're in the business of turning money into capital, and with that, trying to impose your might as an imperial candidate. And we see, in fact, China entering that phase of its development. So despite the fact that it flopped down the early days of the outbreak, the fact that it was able to build hospitals in 10 days and bring in 40,000 health workers and really do everything it could to bring the hammer down on the outbreak really shows that along with its interests in trying to extend its influence around the world, it has an interest in making sure that there's a public health available for it to exercise that influence. The United States, you're on the other end of that. We're in the business here of actually turning capital back into money, and that's just another way of saying cashing out. So you have a lot of the capitalist class here are in the business of basically raking in as much money as they can, offshoring it into their accounts, and basically selling off what we know as the public commons. So we talked about public health being sold off or neglected, but that extends to the other things. But it is remarkable to see, as you said, the mask being pulled off in only in a matter of weeks, to see what was already underlying there come full force. In such a way that, you know, the desire and, in fact, almost cult-like fetishizing of demanding that working people go to work and hold up the economy so that they could be killed. The desire to call them, as the president did, warriors, the desire to call our nurses and our grocery workers heroes, when in fact they're being deployed as martyrs. If you're not interested in providing them the personal protective equipment, if you're not giving them hazard pay, if you're not giving them the medical care necessary that to avoid getting sick, but also if they should get sick to be taken care of, our complete incapacity to do testing. Our recently, Rudolph Giuliani was on TV making fun of the notion of contact tracing. So the basic public health needed that other countries have demonstrated to basically get rid of or destroy or stop the outbreak is now a butt of joke among our political class. The likelihood of having a vaccine is unlikely, certainly not within the next 18 months. There's never been a coronavirus vaccine. So this notion that the silver bullet's going to come in and save us is not necessarily going to happen. You see, in some sense, a complete abandonment of the idea of an organizing around a public crisis. We have a political class incapable of understanding what a public crisis is, and that every opportunity here is really a means by which to enrich rich cronies and push everybody to work. And it isn't really a matter of Trump and his son-in-law and his cronies. We see this here on the Democratic side as well. Joe Biden is, if you recall, there was a conversation that he had with the president by phone, and they both were quite congenial about it. I've come to the conclusion that Joe Biden called Donald Trump to tell him that he would have to reopen the economy again. And there might be a disagreement over how exactly to do that, but as both of them are representatives of the capital class, there was a discussion, an agreement that this could no longer happen. So in essence, Trump has waved the white flag, declared, and in many ways, like he has done his entire life, he has spun off the coronavirus response as just another bankruptcy that someone else can pay for. In this case, though, it's not merely money that's to be picked up by the public tab, but in the very lives of everyday people.
Let me ask you a question. I agree that the record of science demonstrates that there are no magic bullets, that we're looking at 12 to 18 months, if not years, before a virus is upon us. What would you say the opinion of the scientific community is and might be if there were a fundamental revamping of scientific research in the United States and worldwide. Couldn't we say that while there is no magic bullet, and while yes, the pandemic is directly associated with the increasing proximity of human beings to ecosystems which contain species that carry these viruses that we would normally not be in contact with, and that the viruses in the modern globalization period are going to be spread regardless, wouldn't you say that if there is such a thing, on a purely scientific basis, if science was organized for the people, so to speak, and coordinated, and the knowledge obtained was made available immediately, so false starts would be avoided and countless years, hours, and days saved, wouldn't you say that the future portends, assuming it's a future not based on the subordination of human beings to corporate profit, a perspective that would allow us to think that a vaccine could be found?
Well, I'm an evolutionary biologist by training. I'm very much a natural scientist. I do appreciate much of the work that science has done. I also know and understand that science evolved and out of a relationship with capitalism early on. There are, of course, there is, for instance, a book about the people's history of science. So there are other sources by which scientific practice comes about. There's much to be said for what science has done. It helps us learn much about the world. But we have, of course, the interesting phenomenon of seeing many scientists, in essence, rolled over and, in essence, hand in glove with a political system that is in the business of actually causing many of the problems that scientists are ostensibly supposed to be solving. So, you have, and I began the discussion with the notion of that there are some work dedicated to trying to blame indigenous and smallholders, and that work is around the scientific practice of what's called One Health, which on its own terms is actually a very good vantage point. The notion that wildlife and livestock and humans share health, and we should actually look at ecosystems as a unit in terms of how we address how these pathogens might emerge. But some of the organizations involved in spearheading that objective are in essence taking money from the very companies engaged in deforestation. So you have Colgate-Palmolive, you have Johnson & Johnson are in essence funding these efforts. And so the very means by which we might stop the pathogen from emerging in the first place becomes merely the next generation in greenwashing, allowing these companies to go in and do their business. I think vaccines are important. I think developing antivirals are important. And as you say, in a system in which we're not in the business of merely rolling over profit, turning people's labor to somebody else's capital, much of that effort can be dedicated toward coming up with some of these solutions. But I also think that we're in an era in which many of the pathogens that are emerging are not necessarily vulnerable to such interventions. So previously, you can come up with a vaccine for polio, and in part because it reflects what's vulnerable, that what polio as a vaccine is vulnerable to. But many of these new pathogens that are emerging are expressing characteristics that allow them, they have attributes that permit them to, in essence, sort of circle around those interventions. And so, we have an effective vaccine for Ebola right now. And yet we just came out of the longest running Ebola outbreak ever recorded in the Congo. And the question then is, why wasn't that vaccine able to stop this thing cold? And it has to do with the political economy of the area, has to do with the neocolonialism involved, yes, but some of these pathogens are able to hide out from some of these interventions. So if we were able to squash a pathogen by virtue of an antiviral, because some of these pathogens are circulating among different hosts, they could hide out into different hosts, evolving in such a way that they can spill over again once they evolve solutions to some of our medical interventions. So I think what it is that, of course, I mean, it's really wonderful that we come up with biomedical interventions, but I think we have to enter a new age where our notions of eco-socialism have to extend out to integrating the fact that we are living beings on this planet, and we are having to come to some sort of a ecological agreement in such a way that, yes, as humans, we do have the right to appropriate nature and to be able to persist and live. But we need to, in essence, abandon the notion of expropriating nature in such a way that we destroy the very basis upon which our society and even our species depends.
I just want to comment, Rob, that one of our listeners is Cliff Connor, who is the author of People's History of Science. And he was the one that asked the question about the idea of a general vaccine. I am one of those optimistic folks, not that I subordinate science, to a rational organization of human society that deals with the horrors that climate change and the devastation of wildlife, the increasing destruction of forests, jungles, and everything else is critical. But I also am optimistic. You know, when I was a youngster, I read Sinclair Lewis's book. I was an aspiring biologist, and I think it was Dodsworth, or one of the books, where a young man was involved in the corrupt practice of science, institutional science. And Sinclair Lewis's conclusion almost 100 years ago was that he had the hero setting up a lab in his own living room, looking for a cure. And that is the individual solution, free from the exigencies of capitalist profit. Today, imagine the entire world scientific community and all the scientists to come, who young people who have all of the abilities to become science, but are prohibited to even having a fundamental education. I'm optimistic that a cure is not too far away, because I'm optimistic that humanity will defend its own interests in the same way that we see these warehouse workers who are told to go into infected factories and package up commodities for profit for the Amazons and the Walmarts or whatever. They're told to go to work under conditions that would kill them, and a number of them have already died. And I think that's going to anger people. They're asking, as you said, for premium pay, for extended health care, for more time off and stuff like that. I think these things will become widespread. I think that the lifting of the veil, as I said, on the basic structure of a society that can't provide for human beings and yet can provide more than enough food and housing and shelter, everything is up for grabs. California, for example, freed 10,000 prisoners in the last month, telling us something about the racist nature of the criminal justice system, which incarcerates the largest number and percentage of its people on earth. And the vast number of them, 70, 80%, are there for nonviolent crimes. Why can't we build a society that frees these prisoners and engages them in lives where they don't engage in antisocial activity? What I'm saying in short is, no matter which way I look, I sense that the conditions daily, not global warming, which is daily, but years ahead, the disaster, or nuclear war, which has the potential to destroy the planet Earth, but is not apparently immediately before us. But today's crisis is in my view, worldwide and unprecedented, and will shake the consciousness of working people and lead them to the conclusion there's something fundamentally wrong with the system, and that Biden versus Trump is not the solution. In fact, amazingly, nobody's talking about the elections in the United States. You read the New York Times and you're lucky if you see one article in the entire publication about the elections. And that's not an accident. It's because even the Times understands that all the protestations of Trump and Biden and the others, Democrats and Republicans, are just rhetoric, are just empty promises, including, I must say, to close my point here, Bernie Sanders, who has a $17 trillion program for a Green New Deal that doesn't include nationalizing the very industries who produce fossil fuel today in unprecedented amounts, to the point where even on their scales, the value of oil is negative per barrel. It's an insane system, and I think people will come to question it.
Well, it's nice to be optimistic. And I do think that unless we have some sort of vision about how to get out of this, then we're all we're doing is spinning wheels and separated out in our separate apartments here. And obviously, none of us wants to continue to be in this position. None of us wants to. I'm sure many of us already know someone who has died from this. And so there is something startling about having an immediate contact with something which, particularly here in the United States, we've been largely protected from, although that's not always the case, right? You have millions of people whose life expectancy has been declining as a population over due course. And in fact, much of the country is built on the back of historically through slavery and genocide. So that has been, in essence, weaved into the history of the country in such a way that, in some sense, Trump ordering everybody back to work, and in my view, Biden signing on is in some ways a recapitulation of that very history. When you have in Georgia, 80% of the hospitalizations are among African Americans for COVID. There is I think, due cause or reason why the Georgia governor decided to open up, because he knows at this point that he can spin off the worst of the damage upon the poor and people of color. And so it is a really horrible and fascinating notion that some of the worst instincts of the country are in play in that way. So, and I did start this point here with a note of I wanted to be optimistic about something, and I'll get to that in a second. But we really have to be, I think, on point and very clear about what damage that we're about to enter. I mean, this is something on the verge of and as the numbers you quoted at the beginnings, on the verge of a true Great Depression that we haven't seen. Not just since the Great Depression, but I mean, this is a really remarkable sense of a nation state unspooling. And not to overplay things, but revolutionaries have been accused of predicting the last 7 of the 0 revolutions. So, while we have to be optimistic about things, we also have to be cold stone sober about what we're up against. Now, my optimism goes in something of a different direction. My optimism isn't necessarily wrapped into the scientific community. I believe them, for the most part, been largely bought and sold. However, I will have a caveat in there built in. If you remember, in 2017, there was the March on Science. Everyone was very disturbed over how Trump was, in essence, and of course, we hear in the pandemic, it's all very clear how science has been put off the stage and such. But I believe the damage that scientists have been feeling extends back 40 years with the introduction of neoliberalism as a organizing principle here in the United States and elsewhere. And you see a decline of what was a post-World War II iron bowl, as it were, that agreement between American scientists. And you said it yourself about the militarization of science. Scientists, if we worked for the imperial state, our needs will be taken care of. Once neoliberalism entered the public sphere, public universities, many of the campuses turned into research R&D. Much of the work was done organized around helping companies make profit and not the public needs. Here in the Midwest, a lot of the land-grant universities abandoned farmers and their research needs in favor of agribusiness R&D. And so in effect, what we have here is kind of a bifurcation, splitting off. On one hand, some scientists are willing to do R&D and other scientists have been abandoned, become increasingly radicalized. You have the reestablishment of science for the people. You have establishment of scientific collectives dedicated more to the needs of everyday people in terms of their research needs. So it's a fascinating development of what I would consider some aspect of parallel governance that seems to be beginning to get in play. But my feeling about it, though, is organized around that kind of science has to be dedicated more to true collaboration between people who have understanding of research methods and the people that they're interested in serving. And so you have increasingly collaborations between research groups and community groups in coming up with the means by which their research needs are taken care of. I'm part of a group called Pandemic Research for the People, or PrEP, and that is a series of working groups, a collaboration of scientists and community groups around some of the needs around this pandemic. We have a group called PrEP Neighborhoods involved in some of the kind of mutual aid stuff that needs to go on. But at the same time, of course, the government needs to be pressured into providing things that only that scale of intervention is capable of helping out with. So my optimism goes more into the direction of, yes, we're going to have to do something because we have been largely given in very clear terms to, in essence, to go F off. And now we must turn to each other and ourselves to be able to come up with some of these solutions. And now in terms of how we might deal with the pandemic, I believe that many of these new pathogens are emerging out of industrial agriculture, or the means of cutting into the forest and developing industrial livestock there. And all of that agriculture is dedicated to turning what is a natural economy into an industrial economy in such a way that it helps. In the course of industrializing food production, we also industrialize the pathogens that are circulating among them, increasing their virulence, increasing their infectiousness, increasing their global scope. So in essence, we have a series of new pathogens that are circulating like hurricanes out in the Atlantic, one after the other. COVID-19 is not going to be the last of this. Many more are circulating on their way, but there is a way to push back, and that involves changing agriculture as we know it, moving opposite direction, and that still can feed millions around the world. So you can regionalize production. You could return farming decisions to farmers. That leads to increase the farmer autonomy, increased community control of agricultural production, increase the agrobiodiversity of the animals that are raised in such a way that you introduce immune fire breaks into your food production. So even if a pathogen emerges, it can't figure out the immune system of the very different series of poultry and livestock one farm over. You allow animals to be able to reproduce on site in such a way that industrial production doesn't do. And in essence, of any animal that survives being infected can reproduce and pass on into immunogenetics to the next generation. And so in other words, what I'm getting at here, to wrap up a long point here, I apologize, but the big picture here is that I do believe that many of the solutions are out there. There is in essence a secret history of peoples all through the decades that have been pushing back, coming up with different ideas of doing things. And we just need to be able to be in a position to allow those great ideas to come to the fore and change the very nature of our country.
I agree. There's always a delicate balance regarding what revolutionaries, socialists, can realistically propose and what is possible. What I'm saying is that today, as never before in my life, and I'm 80 a few days ago, the contradictions of the system are coming to the fore. So, for example, leading spokesperson media like the New York Times said, well, we're never going to get back to where we were. We're never going to be able to employ the 35 million that just lost their jobs in the last 7 weeks. The problems are technological and they are global. What they mean by technological is that capitalism, ever in competition, is constantly seeking to innovate the means of production and substitute machines and robots for people. So the lesson of the capitalists from this crisis is to intensify the use of robots. That's what they did in China. They started 20, 30 years ago by offshoring, roughly speaking, the entire garment industry to Hong Kong and China, where they could have teenage dormitory women working in factories at 6 cents an hour. Today, those factories are automated, with tens of thousands of millions of people lost their jobs, and in some cases, the employers turned them into sex slaves as opposed to garment workers. For the capitalists, the substitution of machines for people is necessary to stay competitive. If they don't, their opponents will, and they'll lose that market share. And the same thing with a bigger question, and I'm going to leave this one to you. I get a strong sense that without using the words, people like Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of England, and what's his name, Trump, Donald, have in the back of their minds the idea that you're never going to find a vaccine. So you might as well send the wage slaves back to work and let herd immunity take its toll. Let the virus spread if we lose 1 million or 2 or 3, and eventually a significant enough percentage of the population becomes infected with the virus. Their, quote, natural immunity, antibodies, which we don't even know if they are sufficient to ward off the next round of the disease, but basically, when you get a high enough percentage of the population that are ill, even if we lose 1 million or 2 or 3, we'll get past this situation. Let nature take its course. Social Darwinism in the extreme, herd immunity. That's what I hear when people talk about returning to work. Literally, a British government survey said we're willing to take the risk of sending people back to work, even if the death toll in Great Britain is 3.5 million. That's only a fraction. Their wage slaves will still be at the wheels of industry. I'm beginning to hear that from the Trump administration, and now matched by the governors, who all say, yes, we're for returning to work, but on a rational basis. California's Gavin Newsom is talking about a rational basis of opening the schools, where we have 25,000 or 30,000 people who've tested positive in California, despite all the progressive stay-in-place legislation. I want to know, and if I'm speculating too much, but is this herd immunity, in quotes, a reality in the minds of some in the scientific community based on the thesis that we're never going to find a virus in time, there's nothing we can do, we have to produce commodities for the system, so what the hell? Let them perish. Am I crazy?
No, I mean, what you're getting at, and Lisa just informed us that she wants us to wrap up, so I'm going to use this as my way to say my final words for now and just say what you're getting at, Jeff, is our political class, not only here in the United States, but around the world, are basically run by sociopaths who are in essence perfectly reasonable, willing and able to be mass murderers. And I think, you know, the world wars show that very clearly, although clearly destroying Hitler was important. There is a willingness upon the political classes to engage in exactly these kind of calculations. That's how they're able to make through the various filters necessary to get in the position of power in societies that are in essence bourgeois dictatorships. I mean, no one gets their needs handled better than the capitalist class. And so, and you see this playing out very well in the stages. The utter willingness to indeed to use ideological spin to position workers as heroes when they are in fact martyrs for a system that in essence produces surplus value and riches for everyone but the very people who actually produce the riches themselves. So, you know, the question, of course, is whether or not working people can step to and decide that they want something different. And that's going to be very difficult, but I think, as we'll see, that as people are forced with impossible choices about, and as they are right now, you know, either you go to work and risk getting potentially ill, or you don't go to work and you can't pay your bills or even your food. In fact, it's not merely a Sophie's choice that's being imposed. I mean, it's or being presented or as an emergent property of just the circumstances we're in. Some of the governors are actually enforcing it. So you have the Republican governor of Iowa, who basically declared that the meatpacking workers would not be eligible for unemployment. So that is in essence trying to force them back into the plants to be able to continue producing what is the major commodities of that particular state. So yeah, these are horrible people, and you know, we have to move in a direction that we see and find leadership that is not organized around those principles. Because whether or not they're a Republican or Democrat or in other countries around the world, they might be other political parties, which there are different brands for the same product, which is how best to serve the bourgeoisie. So what's necessary moving forward is to really assimilate that we are truly at a generational crossroads here. I mean, it's either the terrible thing is to end up in the fascistic dictatorships around the world who impose these kind of choices upon people, or are people going to throw this off and actually begin to move in a direction where we can continue to exist here on this planet? There are all sorts of examples of people pushing back on this regard, and there are throughout history examples of different ways of doing things, organizing our societies differently. I think most definitely we'll have to be internationalists about it. We've spoken a lot here about the United States because we're currently based here, but in order for us to be able to free ourselves out here in the United States, we have to be able to interconnect with all sorts of movements around the world. As an Australian farmer said to me, it's going to take internationalism to defeat globalization. And I think that's the direction we're going to need to go in, to have a kind of international solidarity with people around the world. The pandemic is only one example of the kind of global threat that we all share together. Several of the people who have written in have also asked us about climate change. The pandemic and climate change are foundationally integrated with each other. Obviously, shifts in the alienation of the environment in such a way that as if we don't live here has led to off waste that in one case is too much carbon and methane, and in the other case, too many pathogens and infections circulating. So we can, I mean, this really has just shown us this disaster that going along to get along ain't going to help us, and that we are, if we have any shot of being able to survive as a people, as a species, we're going to have to overthrow those sociopaths.
I agree entirely. Lisa, do you have some closing remarks? And thank you so much, Rob. It's been enlightening for me.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thanks. I just want to say a big thank you to Rob Wallace for joining us and sharing his just real broad knowledge and expertise on this issue with us tonight. Again, check out his book, Big Farms Make Big Flu. It's a great read, and he's got that article in Monthly Review. I will say that I am reading A People's History of Science. I just happen to have it sitting here next to me. So if people are interested in this topic, this is also a great read. I want to thank Jeff also for sharing his incredible breadth of knowledge with us tonight. And thanks to everyone who joined us on the chat and for sharing your questions and comments and ideas. So obviously this is a topic that's going to be affecting us for a long time, and something that we're going to continue discussing and continue strategizing about how we can fight back and build a real people's movement to make a better world. So please stay tuned to the Socialist Action YouTube channel. Check out our website, socialistaction.org, and our newspaper and articles published on there on a regular basis. Thanks for joining us tonight, and be well and be safe, everyone.
Thank you.